Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm just having to sort a few things out before we start. It won't take me long. Which one do I want? Okay, it's taking a bit of time. I don't know what it is at this time of day. The internet just goes very slowly for some reason for me. Oh. Here. Okay, slideshow. Okay. No. I don't know what to do there.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Karim.
Good.
Sorry.
Did you receive my PowerPoint yesterday?
Which one?
For the workshop.
For tomorrow? For today? Wait. The workshop for today?
For today, yeah. I sent you the French edit.
I've already done it. I did it last night.
Yeah, but anyway, I was confused that you have been working. You will be working on the French, so I did the French for you.
No. I had done it, but
Did you receive?
No, I don't remember receiving it, to be honest. Which one? What time did you send it?
No problem. Anyway,
it's okay. I mean, I done it
anyhow.
Oh no, I'm getting confused now. Which one we're doing? I'm just waiting for the. My machine's being really slow for some reason.
Hello.
Hi,
yeah, thank you for putting together this presentations, translating it.
Yeah,
I've seen that.
Yeah, and Paula said that Portuguese was fit for purpose. She didn't say that. She said something different, but that's basically the gist of what she said. I said that there'll be some issues perhaps with my glue and sellotape that I used, but anyway. I believe so, unless you're speaking something else. Okay.
So probably we can start. Seems like how many people?
At this time of day, it does something weird for me. It just slows right down and it takes forever to get things done. It is very irritating. Anyway, we are almost good to go here. It was something was wrong with my slides in French and Portuguese, but we're here. They're there now.
Oh, that's it. That's good. Yeah.
Okay, right. So I'm sorry, everybody. My head's been in a bit of a different space since about 3 hours ago, and I've been lecturing monetary policy, so I'm got to get my head back into this space, but we'll get there. Right. What do I want to do? I want to share this. Okay. Oh, welcome to day 4 of fiscal policy analysis, everybody. Please select whichever set of slides you want to look at. I've got the French and Portuguese on the different screens from the English. So if you can see English and you want French and Portuguese, please select the other screen, and vice versa. If you're seeing French and Portuguese but you want English, you'll have to switch screens. So there's a workshop after this. We asked you to read the workshop background paper. If you haven't read it, please, during the break, try and quickly run through it, because you need to do that. And for tomorrow, again, you need to have read the notes for tomorrow before tomorrow. You need to do that as homework tonight. The way we're going to run the workshop after this, we'll introduce the workshop in plenary. I'll take about 20 minutes or so to do that, maybe a bit longer. You'll then go off into your workshop groups to discuss a particular question. You'll be given about half an hour for that, and then you're going to come back to the main room to present. You're going to choose somebody to say what your group's thought about. So we're going to do that today, and we'll do that tomorrow for the workshop. At the start of the week, Anna introduced this topic altogether, the course, and outlined the course, and she gave you some trends in the recent past, and she gave you some of the fundamental building blocks for doing fiscal policy analysis. I then followed that on the Tuesday on the measurement stick that we use for that, which is the Government Financial Statistics Manual's framework for doing the accounting. Yesterday, Karim then started from the point of doing some projections in both expenditure and revenue sides. He talked about elasticity and buoyancy, or elasticité and elasticité globale is the term for buoyancy in French, and a phrase that's somewhat similar to that in Portuguese. And the fundamental point about that was that we are relying on there being some link to GDP or some other appropriate measure that is itself linked to GDP to calculate what our revenue is likely to be. And there are some assumptions we have to make in that. And Karim also then went on to a little bit of a projection on the expenditure side. So today we're now going to focus on expenditure policy, and tomorrow we'll have this somewhat very heavy lecture on revenue mobilization, or tax, so to speak. So that's roughly what we're doing. Any questions from anybody on what we've done or before we start this lecture? If not, forever hold your peace, because we're about to kick off. Here we go. So, oops, I went too fast. So there's the outline. I've got 4 major blocks in here. This first thing about why it matters, expenditure policy. This topic on trends in public spending. Then the third part of this is in terms of rationalizing expenditure and the things that you need to think about in terms of any reform. And then we've got a last section here on longer term expenditure issues for effectively for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, because we've cut these lectures down a bit, there are some appendices to this lecture which have got some detail, a lot of detail, in fact, in some of them, on specific topic areas, which we will touch on during the lecture, but we're not going to go into too much detail. I strongly encourage you to look at these appendices after the lecture, if you've not already looked at them beforehand. They'll give you some greater detail on things. There may be some questions you've got during the lecture, which will refer you to the appendices. So why does it matter? Well, this is as in Charles Dickens with Mr. Micawber, income £1, spending £1.06. The result is misery. And if my income's £1 and my expenditure is 19 shillings and 6pence, the result is happiness. And that's sort of pretty much the same for governments. If we spend too much, it's going to result in misery in one way or another at some point in time. But more importantly, the first point is, what should the government be doing? How and why should it be spending money? What are the sorts of activities a government should be getting itself engaged in? And then as a corollary to that, once the government's decided to go and do something, what's the best way to do it? Now, the way we've got it on this slide is here, what's the most efficient way to do it? So there's many things we need to think about when we're spending the public money. The first is this got a proper purpose? Because if it hasn't, why are we doing it in the first place? Secondly, if we're going to do this, how can we maximize the benefit to the public from us undertaking this activity? And then lastly, how can we maximize that benefit and do it in a very efficient way in terms of spending the money? If we don't consider those questions, we're going to have problems. Typically, we're just going to spend money for no good purpose at all. And you can see what happens when countries have to go and quickly change focus, take on a new activity, and there's not sufficient safeguards or thinking around how they're doing it. I'm sure you're all aware of a degree of a number of faux pas during the past 2 years where the governments have needed to do something. The thinking around it in terms of the need is clear, but then how to do it has not been thought through well. And there are horror stories of hundreds, billions of dollars misspent on what at first sight are good things, good ideas, but very, very poorly thought out and very poor spending decisions made. So that's that first point in here, the process around what we're going to be doing. But then this other main point on this slide is also important. A key thing is that public expenditure, whether it's central government, state or provincial government, local authority, in aggregate, that's a huge amount of overall aggregate demand. And historically, not so much. But today, it's anywhere between, depending on the country type, between about 15 and 40, sometimes nearer 50% of overall aggregate demand. That's a huge chunk. So the government's expenditure decisions can have massive impacts on the rest of the economy. And particularly the poor central bank that's got to try and keep price stability when you've got a government that's spending like there's no tomorrow. This therefore has significant impacts, not just on demand, but if the government's demanding things that are not in good supply, that's going to have some negative consequences, not just for inflation, but in longer term things that you need to be thinking about, such as in this bracket here, overall public investments, whether we've got sufficient people to do this. So generally, the government spending has got pretty major implications, macroeconomic implications across critical macroeconomic axes: output, prices, employment, external balance, and so on. And there's a very close link between the government's budget balance and the external balance. If the government's budget balance is in deficit, you're generally going to observe an external budget balance that's negative. When the government's got a lot of demand on things that are in short supply, prices are going to go up, and so on. So it matters. It's very important. Any questions on that before I'm going to move the slides anyway, but any questions, anyone? So I've touched on some of the things in here, but clearly, if we're going to be spending money and there's not sufficient capacity, where the budget's not big enough, we're going to have to borrow the money. That's going to impact interest rates. But that spending, if it's above trend for the government, that's going to impact demand in the economy, and therefore the monetary policy agent is going to be wanting to have tighter monetary policy, which will itself increase interest rates in most scenarios, and it will impact the exchange rate. By changing how much we're spending, whether increasing or decreasing it, that's going to have impacts on savings and investments. So that's something we need to think about. And given that in today's form of government, many, but not all, governments are quite active in redistributing the output of the economy, the money, the wealth of the country across to socioeconomic sectors, socioeconomic groups that are not need support, they're not wealthy, they've got significant inclusion issues. This redistribution aspect is very important. And fundamentally, it comes down to, are we appropriately allocating the country's resources? These are things that have all got to be thought through carefully. And for those of us who are working in the Ministry of Finance or an equivalent ministry, or has got a role in what they're doing that is directly impacting on the allocation of resources, you need to be fully aware of the impact of what you're doing and any policy advice you give to the political decision makers. Governments tend to work on a 1 year at a time budget framework, but increasingly in the past several decades, it's become realized that you need to be thinking longer term. And you need to have a medium-term budget concept. Medium-term budget, medium-term fiscal frameworks are important. We don't directly go into that here. That's more the fiscal frameworks course that does that. But you need to be thinking about what's happening this budget year and policy advice, and policy thinking this year with the longer term economic goals, so that there's a consistency across time, across expenditure and so on, between what you're doing now, what you're thinking now, and in the future. And underneath all of that, the expenditure and the tax policies need to be thinking about how to support sustainable growth, how to support the central bank in its mission to keep prices stable, low inflation, through the longer term. These are really important things you need to be thinking about as a policymaker, or even as just a junior assistant in a policy team working on this. Everybody has got something to do with thinking about this. Anybody else? Anybody who wants to chip in on this? Okay. So we mentioned at the start about rationalization, and the part of the problem we get is that unless we are trying to keep our focus on delivering what we're supposed to be delivering in an efficient and effective way, if we don't do that, the government's footprint on the economy will just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's not sustainable. And to fund that, one of the reasons it's not sustainable is you're going to have to need to raise taxes. Mamadou, you have a hand up. Please speak.
Oui, bon, c'est juste une question peut-être de passage. Je ne sais pas si je peux attendre jusqu'à la fin de la présentation ou si je peux poser la question. Je sais pas.
You ask. If it's not relevant, I'll tell you. If it is relevant, I'll tell you. But regardless, just ask. Just ask.
D'accord. Tout à l'heure, dans votre passage, on a compris que la dépense ou les dépenses publiques que l'État doit mener doit être cohérente avec les objectifs économiques. J'ai un petit souci par rapport, lorsqu'on est dans une période où nous sommes à une période d'inflation, par exemple. Comment l'État peut mener une politique de dépenses publiques qui va tout à fait être cohérent, tout en menant la politique en question? Peut-être une politique de redistribution ou bien une politique de soutien par rapport à un secteur économique. Comment l'État peut mettre en place cette dépense qui doit être cohérente avec les objectifs économiques, mais tout en n'étant pas rehausser en fait de plus l'inflation. Je ne sais pas si j'ai bien posé ma question.
It's not easy, all right? So there's a set of priorities that each country needs to decide on. And although I said that what you're doing now, you need to be linking it to your coherent longer-term policies. At times, there may be some disconnects. It's at times very difficult to be completely consistent, but it, the very least needs to be borne in mind. So let's just I'm going to simplify what you've asked here to try and make it easier to see what's going on. So say we decide, for argument's sake, that our priority is going to be on redistribution of wealth across the country. And so we're going to set tax rates to impact those who are earning the most, impact those who've got control of the country's assets most. And we're going to just give that money in one way or another to the people who need it most. In doing that, we may have to set tax structures up that are eye-wateringly painful for some people. And so they will not like to pay it. So they will do everything they possibly can to not pay it. That, though, is sucking resources out from those people, will tend to have a modest impact potentially on inflation. It will reduce it because we're taking demand out of the economy. But we're taking it from people who generally will have a higher savings rate. So by doing that, we are shifting that savings investment balance at the margin as well. We need to be aware of that. But we're now going to take that money and spend it in one way, give it one way or another to people who need it most. Because they can't save, they need to spend everything, they will spend it. And so their expenditure generally tends to be more inflationary than when you give somebody a tax cut. When you give tax cuts, the people who benefit most from those generally are the people who will save it rather than spend it. So unless this is done with a bit of thought, you are going to impact the savings investment balance, but you're also going to be impacting inflation. So you need to be quite careful how you think about it. And it's not easy. Every country's different. The needs of each country and the people who you're trying to help in terms of redistribution are all quite different. So it's a matter of coordinating across government with the central bank also involved to work out how to best coordinate policy to achieve the aims that the government's trying to achieve. And it's not simple, and I can't at this instant give you a simple cheat sheet or list of things you need to be doing, but I'm just trying to show you how difficult it can actually be. And I think I've done that. Are you okay with what I just said, Mamadou?
Oui, c'est bon, c'est bon. Merci pour la réponse, la clarté. Merci.
And what I've just been saying, right, that's effectively what's on this slide here. Okay. So rationalization has to be done carefully, thoughtfully. Although often it isn't, that people just do something, right? And you get unforeseen consequences. So these are some principles we need to bear in mind. They're not difficult, they're reasonably obvious principles to keep in mind in terms of the objectives for public expenditure. Promote efficient spending of the taxpayers' money aimed for keeping stable, sustainable economic growth. And then as a second objective, so it's not the first one, it's the second one, try to meet the distributional policy objectives for enhancing inclusion and reducing poverty. But that may at times have to take a back seat because there may be other things that you have to deal with first. So this is always a bit of a balancing act. And that's what these two red lines are talking about. In the French, it's only one red line, but it's two things, isn't it? Okay. What's the appropriate level of spending to do all that? And what should be the role of the government? And as a corollary to all of that, having a continuous sense of expenditure reform. You should always be thinking, how can we best do this? And what do we need to do to shift our labor or balance within the government or our policy balance within the government to achieve these objectives? And you can only do that, though, on a medium-term framework. And to underpin that, you've got to strengthen the budget institutions. So I think that's things like having fiscal rules, for example, and that the fiscal rules being backed up with things like third-party oversight councils, fiscal councils that are somewhat ideally independent of government, but just to give the third-party check on it. And say that's the focus, one of the focuses of the fiscal frameworks course. So the role of government. What is it? there's a quote which is just escaping me, and it's a French quote. And it will come back to me at some point. So, so the government's, as McLean says in this 1987 paper, the government can have rules to make markets work efficiently and corrective interventions when there are market failures. That's quite good. That's reasonably well known. Sometimes the markets cannot do things because they don't fully see everything that they need to be thinking about. So that's one good one. We need to have a framework for the state to create and enforce rules, establish law and order, and ensure property rights. That's something that we can see in history, right? And then the state must play a role in providing services. It's got this list of services here, right? And to underpin that, well-educated labor force and adequate infrastructure are fundamental to the quality of private investment. All those things were in this 1992 World Bank paper. Maybe not written this way, but these have been around for a long time. You know, and by a long time, I want people to suggest numbers here now. So, and it doesn't matter whether you think you're right or wrong. I just want people to take some guesses at numbers. How long have the principles that are in this slide been known in one sense or another? As it 20 years, 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. How long have we known about these sorts of things generally? And I'd like somebody or several somebodies to give me some shout out and just give me some numbers. Take a guess. By the way, you don't have to know it, just take a guess. Can somebody shout at me? Come on, take a guess. If I have to ask Karima and Anna, you've all failed on this. I'll give you a few more seconds.
Can I say something?
What was that, Samuel?
Yeah, I want to contribute.
Yeah, just give us a number. How many years? 50 years, 100 years, whatever. You tell me, how many years do you think?
Probably 80 years.
80 years. Samuel's got 80 years. Do I have any advance on 80? We're having a bidding war now, so any advance on 80? Do I hear 100? I've got 80. Anybody want to advance on that? Does anybody want to cut it
100.
to 60? Kareem says 100. Any advance on 100? I've got 100. 100 once. 50. I've got a 50. What else? 50. We've got 100. We've got 80. We've got 50. Anybody else? Anybody want to go beyond 100? Do I have anybody wishing to go beyond 100 years? Anna, do you want to 125? Anna, do you want to throw in a bid?
Well, have to let me think.
Okay, whilst Anna's thinking, have we got any more numbers to throw into this? Anybody? Anna, do you want to throw in the number you've got in your mind on this? Take a guess if you don't have any idea. Just take it, any number.
Je peux y aller hein, depuis 63 ans, principalement avec les travaux de Musgrave qui a essayé de parler du rôle des fonctions de l'État. C'est depuis lors qu'on a une idée sur les fonctions qui doivent remplir les dépenses publiques. 63 ans.
So Fabrice has got 63. What were you about to say, Anna?
Okay, 70.
70. All right. So I'm talking about principles, all right, everybody? Not exactly the words that are on here, but the concepts that we're seeing written here. I think I'm going to either shock you or you'll start to challenge me, all right? But the reasonable estimate is at least 5,000 years, all right? And it's probably before then, because the Code of Hammurabi is 5,000 years old. And it's like the typical Western European thing of going around the world and pinching things from people. So from ancient Babylon, or thereabouts, there's the stone stele that's in the Louvre in Paris, and it's got the Code of Hammurabi on it. And it's got concepts that are like this. We know, 2 and a bit thousand years ago, the Romans, when they went out through Europe, they knew they had to build infrastructure. They built roads. If you've got Romans, you've got roads. If you've got Romans, you've got aqueducts. They knew they had to put the infrastructure into for the good conduct as a public good. They needed it to run the army through the empire. The other things that are in there about education that's there. Everything that's in this slide, in one sense or another, has been known for an awful long time. It's just that we're not very good at getting on with it and doing it. And there's other things that happen, right? So these concepts have been enunciated in modern terminology, but the fundamental precepts underlying them, they've been known for a long time. So we're just trying to get on with the job that somebody knew about 5,000 years ago. And in the intermediate time, we've not been good at doing it. Anybody shocked with my 5,000 years? Putting aside the interpreters, because I know they've heard me say this before. But anybody want to challenge me on this? I'm open to be challenged. Anybody? I've got no takers. Anyway, never mind. We'll move on. So the role of government, well known for a long time. How well it's been done is another matter. But the key concepts that are embedded in this have been known for ages. There's nothing new under the sun, so to speak. And how effective and efficient is that expenditure? Well, there's a lot of room for improvement in some countries. All right. And how well that money actually delivers what it's designed to do, again, there's often a lot of room for improvement. And I'll just give you a simple example on this. So here, for example, in Mauritius, there are many government subsidies on common goods that are sold. The one that surprised me was LPG for cooking gas. So the cooking gas that you buy at the supermarket, sort of 10 or 5 or 15 kilo bottles, that's got an 80% subsidy on it. But if I buy a 50 kilo bottle of gas, as one was delivered yesterday, there was no subsidy on it. And although there's a lot of gas delivered in the 50 kilo bottles, most people prefer to get it from the supermarket because the government's paying for 80% of it. Now, is it right to put the subsidy on so that everybody gets it? Or are there better mechanisms for spending that money? It is definitely effective in terms of inclusion and targeting people who need the support. But is it actually an efficient use of that money? And these are the sorts of things you've got to think about when you're coming up with a policy, especially when it's a policy for inclusion and supporting people who are in poverty. Because why should you subsidize those who really don't need it? Especially when you realize that if you do a global subsidy, the people who really take the most benefit from it are the people who don't need it. Now, I don't need an 80% subsidy on the gas board, right? And neither do at least, 60% of the population, but they benefit, so the government has a bigger deficit than it needs to have. And they could have spent that money in better ways. So just trivial things like that, you need to think about them. And if we look through time here, right, government expenditure, and this graph, by the way, you could take it back several hundred, if not thousands of years. But actually thinking about it, that graph, we do actually have hard data that can sketch that graph back at least 2,500 to 3,000 years without putting too much sweat into it. So, and historically, it has been 10% or below of total expenditure. And it started to rise during the 19th century in a big way. But the thing is, it's gone up, and definitely since the 19th century, it's gone up quite a lot. And there's some precepts about that. Now, I don't know which course we do this in. Maybe it's FPP, can't remember. Anyway, so this is an exhibit of Wagner's law. Wagner's a German economist in the 19th century. He discovered that basically, as you start to provide public goods and services, the demand for those will keep going up. And the more you give, the more your people will want. And so that drives up government expenditure. And that's exactly what we've seen. Hence, it's important to consider constantly trying to improve the way you deliver public goods and services. Expenditure reform has to be on a continuous basis. And there's another one here that's related, not related exactly, but it goes on to look at the similar things. And that's Baumol's rule. So basically, there are some things where you can't easily get efficiencies, even though technology improves. And as technology improves, our ability to deliver some things definitely increases. But there are some activities where you don't get to see that. But because everything else goes up in terms of its price, these things also go up in price because you're competing to employ people to do things. And that also drives up government expenditure. When Baumol did the work with, what's his name? I can't remember. There's another B as well. Anyway, what they observed was that a symphony orchestra has the same number of people in it today, or when he did the research, as 100 odd years before. Basically, if you're doing symphony orchestra type work, you still need the same number of people to deliver it. And that's the same with many government services. You can't easily improve the efficiencies, but that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't look to improve the efficiencies. You need to think about doing things in a different way, because you cannot keep expanding government expenditure. It's not possible. And you can see that in that graph, government expenditure keeps going up to about 1980. It then it does a bit of a dance around about 40%, and then it took off again in the late 2000 period. And we've seen it shoot up in the past 2 years because of the pandemic. But it's in around about 1980, the late 70s, 1980s, where governments tended to realize that they needed to start to think about constantly reforming how they did things to improve the efficiency of the public sector. And lower income countries, although that graph's going up, there's some good reasons for that, because they're actually expanding what the government's doing. But unless policymakers start at the very beginning to make sure that they're constantly reviewing how they're delivering public services, that the trajectory of those increases would be steeper than they really need to be. So even though it's true that public sector services should increase to try and improve the well-being of the country as a whole, if you keep a constant eye on reforming how you do things, the slope of that increase can be much flatter, and at some point it should flatten off, but you're going to have to work hard to do that. Any questions on this? Okay. So there's a big size difference amongst countries. So you can see, advanced countries about 40%, but within that, there's a huge range, about 21 to 56%, depending on which country. And there are similar things in emerging markets. Again, a bit less than in advanced countries, but you still have these quite broad ranges. And then about 2/3 of it in low-income countries, but again, quite a broad range. And these differences are reflected in those bold bullet points at the bottom there of the screen. So this, we're just setting context, see if you'd be reflecting on as we proceed through this. So social spending, which is an increasingly important component, and in most advanced countries, social spending, social welfare, health and education, they can be taking up to 70% of the total expenditure, maybe a bit more than that. They are the big ticket ministries in most advanced economies. I don't know whether, I think the blue's supposed to be down the bottom here, but I'm not quite sure, right? But you can see that they are quite large blocks. But I know from when I was doing this with the New Zealand government, basically it was about 20 to 25% on each of those three items. And as we've got aging populations and they've got a government delivered old age pension with increasing people at age of retirement and older, the pension spend's just going to go up. And there's not much you can do about that because you've got it locked in. So you have to think about pre-funding some of that pension spending today. And that's one of the special topics in the appendix, as is education. Oh, it is here. Yes, I knew I'd seen it somewhere in this lecture, but couldn't remember. So I've already talked about these, all right? And so because of that, you've got to be on constant lookout for this, which means you've got to constantly think about how to reform so that you can still deliver on these critical policy targets that you've got, bearing in mind that you've got limited fiscal space to do it. So it requires constant thought, constant attention. And that's in part why the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury often has a bad name with other government departments, because all they hear is the Ministry of Finance saying, no, you're not going to spend that. No, you're not going to spend that. No, no, no. It's the no department. If the Ministry of Finance is doing its job, it always says no. Think about it again. Then the minister has to then lobby hard at cabinet to get the other ministers to agree, and then Ministry of Finance gets directed what it's going to do. I think that's generally how it works. Whose hand's that? Is that in the chat?
Yeah, can I want to ask a question.
You've got the presentations. They're in Moodle. You should have downloaded them. If you have not downloaded them, you go and stand in the corner for 5 minutes or something. You've got them here now, but you should have them available to you. The lectures are all downloadable. They're in Moodle under Conference, Lectures, and Palestra. And just download the French, English, or Portuguese as you prefer. What am I talking about here? Yeah. So,
I want to ask a question, please.
Yeah, go.
Slide 12, please. Slide 12.
Slide 12.
Cause
go back.
disease. Can you just throw a light on that? Cause disease. What do you actually mean by that?
I talked about it.
Cause disease.
I talked about it 5 minutes ago. Remember, I talked about the orchestra. So the orchestra, the members of the orchestra, their pay has to go up because everybody else's pay goes up, and people want to listen to orchestras. But if you've got an orchestra, you still have to have first and second violins. You need to have your bassoon. You have to have your percussion instruments. You've got to have all the instruments. You can't just say, I'm going to get rid of 30% of the orchestra just because we've got efficiencies. It doesn't work that way. And it's the same with government. If you're trying to deliver many of these services, you've got to have people involved. So you have to really think hard how to best use those people to deliver the services and to enhance the delivery of those services, despite you've been wanting to constrain the number of people and how much they're going to be paid. That's why it's important to think about how to best, in today's context, how to best make use of the various automation tools we've got so that you can deliver those services. I'll give you a simple example, which I find incredibly irritating here in Mauritius. To go and renew my car registration, I can't just go to the post office. You can, but for me, you can't. So you have to go to the driver registration center in Port Louis. And you can wait for hours there to pay your registration. Hours and hours and hours. And there's hundreds of people queued up there trying to get processed. You don't have to do that. There are far better and far more efficient ways of doing it. But to do that requires them to reform. And there may be reasons why they don't want to reform, right? They may want to use that activity to soak up unemployment. But is that really a good use of the public money? Because the service can be delivered in a far, far better way at much lower cost. And surely there are activities those people could be doing that's more productive than just stamping my registration papers, right? That's Beaumont's cost disease. Wagner's law is where as an economy gets richer, the per capita real income rises, and as definitely as technology changes as well, there's a greater demand for all sorts of public services, and that also increases government expenditure. So bearing those two in mind, a wise policymaker will look at ways of delivering enhanced services, but at the same time reducing the cost significantly of providing the service and trying to improve the quality of the service at the same time. Is that explained for you all right now?
Yeah, thank you very much.
It's not easy to do it, by the way. I mean, what I've just said is easy for me to say, but actually doing it in practice, that can be very challenging. So typically, when you're trying to get out your scalpel to cut expenditure, you generally tend to go for the big ticket items. And but on some of the big ticket items, it's tricky. So if you look on the advanced economies there, half of that yellow block, it's just over 52% of expenditures on social benefits and subsidies. Now, how are you going to reduce that and at the same time get on with the redistribution that you're trying to do? It's a bit tricky, that. So you have to think about it carefully. The next big one is just general government employees. Now, there's a mix here, right? There's both government pay and the number of employees. Frequently, when governments are trying to constrain expenditure, they'll put a hiring freeze on. They will try and reduce the rate of wage growth in terms of the actual hourly rate paid. There's many things that you need to think about in that. And this is part of what you're going to have to think about in terms of the workshop, by the way. And you can see there's quite a difference between the advanced and the emerging market economies, right? In the emerging market economies, there's nearly a quarter of expenditure is on investment, i.e. infrastructure, building schools, hospitals, roads, power stations, all the things that you need so that you can drive innovation and drive growth in the economy. Because if you don't invest, that's not going to happen. And the roads you build will last a long time. You know, look at a map of Western Europe. I know there's modern roads gone in, but those ancient Roman roads, they're still used today. It's just that they've got lots of layers of tarmac and concrete on top of them. If you look at Britain, the A5, this road that goes straight up, that's Watling Street, as it would have been called in Roman times. Still there, but it's several meters below the modern road. Those infrastructure projects lasted a long time. You go to Istanbul, as it's called today, Constantinople. That cost a huge amount of money to build that. There's unbelievable things in there, like there were hidden aqueducts and water systems to supply the city with water if it got besieged. Vast quantities of water stored and hidden. Some of that wasn't rediscovered until 30 odd years ago. It's got major infrastructure works in it that still all work today. Constantinople, well, the primary building phase of it was finished 1,600 years ago. 1,700 years ago, something like that. All right. Good spending that. They got the money's worth out of it, but it cost a fortune, right? When you think about the Temple of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they built that 4 times, it kept falling down because of earthquakes. In the end, they decided to build it all out of concrete. That's a massive cost. Back then, they would have had to deforest huge chunks of land to fire up the kilns to produce the cement for that. It's still standing, stood test of time. It hasn't fallen down, despite being smack bang on a fault line. It costs a lot of money to do that. That's your 23% of infrastructure expenditure, the investment, right? Good investments will last a long time. Poorly thought investment will be not merely a waste of money, but it'll be spent on the wrong investment altogether. Any questions on this? Ian, you've been speaking too quickly. Slow down. So rationalization of expenditure. This is all coming through to this part here, right? How do you do this and deliver on the things you really need to deliver on? And the different things you need to focus on depending upon what type of economy you've got and at what stage of development you've got. And because of that, you have to think about quite different things. And as it says about emerging markets, you're trying to broaden the social aspect of it, but trying to keep fiscal pressures under control. So there's all sorts of things that need to be thought about, and there's some lessons to be learnt from the advanced economies by the emerging economies, because the advanced economies are about 60 to 80 years ahead of you in terms of some of the things that really difficult challenges like these aid-related challenges. You know, countries in Africa tend to be about, on average, ages are about 20 to 30 years younger than in the advanced economies. If you've got 20 to 30 years of breathing space, make good use of that time. So the workshop's going to be looking at that. That's, I think, the wrong number anyway, but we do look at it both. We're to tax side tomorrow. And these are all critical points to think about. The employment one, about education and correctly targeting different layers of the education system. The pension side, the non-pension side for the redistribution purposes, the pension side, healthcare, and then safeguarding public investment. And on education, you see this shift from primary, secondary, tertiary education. Just a brief interlude for the moment. We'll make a quick scenic tour, detour. Education. We've got primary, secondary, tertiary. Which of those is the most effective form of education? The one that gives you the most outcome for the least input? Anybody? 2 or 3 volunteers to shout out? We do come to it at some point. Rather.
Moi, je penserais au secondaire. Au niveau du
Hubert's
secondaire.
got secondary. Hubert's got secondary. So got 1 vote for secondary. Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody for primary? Anybody for tertiary?
Yeah. I for primary. I believe primary reform.
Who was that? Samuel, what did you say? You haven't got a headset, so I can't hear you. Samuel's saying primary. Anybody else? Anybody voting for university? Anybody voting for tertiary, university, polytech? Your best bang for buck. Mamadou, yeah, speak. Don't bother putting your hand up, just shout out. I don't mind. Mamadou.
Bon, moi, je soutiens le, le secondaire, hein, comme l'autre. Je soutiens le secondaire.
Right. Okay, good. That's enough, right? It's a triangle. If you cannot read, if you cannot write, if you cannot do basic mensuration, arithmetic, you can't do anything else. The critical skills are all taught at primary and pre-primary. But countries often bend the expenditures the other way around. But if you haven't got primary education working properly, people cannot properly, fully benefit from the secondary education. But if they can read and they can write, they've got good comprehension skills, they've got good logical thinking skills, they can apply the elementary mathematics they get at primary, they can do all that, you can do anything. It's true that it gets rounded out in secondary, and a very good solid secondary education means that you often don't need tertiary education. But the pinnacle of all that's tertiary. But it's critical to get that primary education right, because if that's not right, nothing else is going to work properly. And unfortunately, many governments do tend to focus on the tertiary and the secondary education rather than the primary layer. It's the primary layer that gives everybody the skills they need to be able to properly benefit from the others. Because if you can read and write, think logically, and do some basic arithmetic, then everything else follows suit because you can read it yourself, you can teach yourself. But if you can't read properly, if you can't do some basic mathematics, nothing else will help you. You've got to get those right first. And I know people would disagree with that, but that's what you actually find if you look through the research on this. Primary education is very important. But thank you, right? And I know that secondary, there's issues with it and it can be improved and it's important. But if you don't get that primary one right, you got no show. So these are some things we've learned from mistakes made in the past about doing reforms. Don't just suddenly say we're going to cut 30% off government expenditure. That is not a good idea. It does not work properly. First and foremost, you upset an awful lot of civil servants. You can get a lot of benefit by appropriate, well-designed and thought out reforms to the public sector, wage framework and so on, but it needs to be very carefully thought out. And you need to think about it as being a continuous reform. Think about how social expenditure is structured. Is it actually reaching the people who need it? And is it being given in the right form for the people who need it? These are some of the simple things where you need to be thinking about the actual social dynamics, right? One thing people found, and it differs across countries, but in one country, they realized that they should not give the money to the men. It was best to give it directly to the women. Firstly, they knew how to spend it and spend it carefully. Secondly, in that particular country, 60% of the men, when they got the money, they just drank it. Therefore, it was not of any benefit. So you need to think about how to best target and to whom it's given. The next thing, if you get your reform structures correct and you do it appropriately, then you can get significant efficiency gains with massive impacts in terms of reducing government expenditure on the things that you're targeting. But if you do not seek to continuously spend appropriately on the infrastructure, you will get problems down the track and they'll be expensive to repair. So if you decide not to spend on the road infrastructure or the rail infrastructure or the power stations and things like that for a period of 5 or 10 years, that's going to bite you back hard and you will not like it. So you've got to be careful about that. So this last point is the critical thing. You've got to have, you think about the effectiveness and the sustainability, and they're most sustainable and effective when you've got some institutions around you to support it. These policy rules, so well-designed expenditure rules and having effective, robust, decentralized frameworks. So you delegate the responsibility down to the lowest level that you can in terms of the people who are responsible for it. You push it out from the central government, you give it to the people who are actually more directly interfacing with it, because they are the people who have to deal with it. They will know, normally know a lot better than central government as to what is effective and what's not effective. Any questions before I move on? And I know I'm running out of time and I'm barely a third of the way through this lecture. Anybody? So this is often a hot topic. We're going to cut the wage bill. How are we going to do it? There are major things done in the Western economies back in the 80s and 90s. And there are some simple things you can do, which people like. There's some simple things that you do which are very unhelpful and people don't like. Carefully designing it's important. We'll talk about some of these things maybe in the workshop. Otherwise, if I start on it now, I will go off on a tangent. So some of these are shown in this slide here. So in some instances, what they found is that changing the wage structure was actually more important than actually reducing total employment. But that's not necessarily always the case, right? And if you've got some short-term measures like they've got here, wage freeze, hiring freeze, they tend to expire after a few years and then people carry on growing again. But about 40% of countries brought in some structural measures. Now, at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in the 1990s, the governor at the time, he was dead keen on killing inflation. He was really focused on making sure that the Reserve Bank itself was efficient and effective, and the bank itself walked the talk about making sure its expenditure didn't go up. It didn't go up too much anyway. When he started, the Reserve Bank had something like 1,000 employees. When he finished it, there were barely 190. And despite that, we actually did far more and more efficiently and effectively than they did with 1,000. And it wasn't that they actually made, well, they did make 800 people redundant in one way or another, but they were all actually allocated to other tasks. Many of them were hired by the commercial banks in one way or another. So they didn't actually not have a job afterwards, they did. But the way it was structured was carefully thought out, and with some exceptions, it was quite well received. But you got to be very careful when you do this. You need to think very, very carefully. And so it's important to think of structure rather than just taking a scalpel out. So it's restructuring how you design your wage formation process, the structure around hiring processes, the structure around the range of services you're offering. You need to have a discussion, a proper collegiate dialogue on this. You should not be doing this as a command control mechanism, because if you do not have people buying into it, you are going to be faced with all sorts of problems. If you're going to be cutting the numbers, you're better to focus on specific roles rather than across everything. And for example, if you say you're going to make, say we're going to make 2 out of every 10 people redundant, regardless of the function, right? And that there's one function where there are only 2 people. If you get rid of those 2 people, the function's not going to happen. And I'm well aware that that type of stupidity has happened in the past. And you've got to be thinking about it. If you're finding that the public sector is paying more than the private sector, there's got to be a good reason for that. And there shouldn't be a big wedge like that. And it needs to be probably the other way around, if anything. If you've got a large staff who are very poorly paid, there's a lot of streamlining you can do. But you've got to be careful, because when you're growing what you're doing in terms of service delivery, like is often happening in sub-Saharan Africa, you can't cut it and expand what you're doing. That doesn't work. So you have to think carefully about it. And education, this is a big ticket item. And if you cut it in some way, it may have the consequences that you don't want. And so if you're trying to improve the educational output, and there's various ways of measuring that, and the OECD has its PISA framework for that. You can see the PISA reports going back for many years now. And that gives you a standardized approach to see whether it's working and how countries are compared with each other. But you need to be careful what you're doing here. Just a simple one here. In 1971, the number of teachers per student, students per teacher in primary school in New Zealand was about 40 to 1, 36 to 1. There was this concept of improving educational outcomes, and we'd halve class sizes, so it went down to 20 to 1. The actual outcomes, no better. In fact, outcomes today are poorer than they were 50 years ago. Yet there's double the number of teachers. There's double the number of teachers, but the actual spending per teacher is now half what it was in real terms. So they've actually cut wages. And there are consequences for that. You need to adapt as things shift. You need to readjust how you're delivering things and where the money's going. But don't forget the point I made before. But clearly, when you don't have too many people at university, you're not going to be spending too much on it. But as more go through to university, you have to realign things. But you've got to be careful about it. The beauty about education, though, and healthcare to a lesser degree, but old age care in particular, you know about, in terms of primary school, you know about 5 years ahead. For secondary school, you know about 12 to 13 years ahead. And for university, you know about 20 years ahead, 18 years ahead, what the demand's likely to be. So you can plan ahead. Social welfare can be a bottomless pit if you're not careful. And so you need to target very carefully, and you need to try and then test whether that expenditure is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So it's not just a matter of spending the money. You've got to find some way of actually checking, testing that money is being appropriately utilized and is producing the benefits that you're aiming for. And for that, one key instrument is surveys. The statistical agency needs to have the appropriate surveys to monitor this and monitor it effectively, efficiently, and frequently. One of the things that government spending is very poor on often is statistics. They try and do get as much out with as little expenditure as possible. It can be a problem. And you've got unemployment benefits. They need to be carefully thought out, because if you pay too much, that's a disincentive to work. But if you don't pay enough, you're basically going to put people into poverty traps. And then how do people, when they're transitioning from being unemployed to employed, there's often a phase where they end up being worse off as they transition back into work, because the benefit structures in such a way and the tax structures in such a way that they end up having less income, which is therefore a disincentive to work. We've got to carefully think about it. And although I know it's not that important yet in this sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that these have been gradually developing over time. And this is from 2018, this picture, right? Southern Africa's got the most expenditure on safety nets rather than the other regions. And as you can see, there's a disparity in the odd one in some ways. And we've got resource-rich oil countries, so in some ways surprisingly have less spending than the non-resource-rich There'll be reasons for that, one way or another, I'm sure. And there's different reasons for having them, like at the end here, this drought exposure one. Clearly, if it's just thinking about farming for the moment, if you don't have any support during drought, you're going to have problems because if the farms can't work, that's going to cut food supply and all sorts of things and exports of goods. So you've got to think about how to protect that. And that is one of that's a spin-off. That's one of the things that's part of the climate change type training that we're doing. So this use of means testing, it helps filter people out. This middle point on general subsidies is the point I was making before about the gas, right? You should not have universal benefit like that to people. It's not good use of the money. And this thing about linking benefits to labor force participation, you've got to think about that very carefully. You can get really perverse outcomes if that's not thought through properly. So these are some of the longer term issues that we've got. Where am I time-wise? Coming up for time. So these are the two sort of special topics that we've got here. One's on healthcare, one's on pension systems reforms. These are important to be thinking about, but they're not, especially the pension one isn't one that's necessarily going to hit you soon, but you do need to think about it. And for some countries, public pensions and healthcare, as it says here, is about 40% of primary expenditure, and it's rising because populations are aging. So it's an area where governments have got to think about how to best reform it, but without the negative consequences of putting a whole load of elderly people into poverty. And healthcare, likewise, there's always a demand to improve the healthcare services and the outcomes, but that just means it keeps going up. And if you compare today with 50, 60 years ago, if you in an advanced country, if you go to see a health professional, they'll often go and demand 20 odd tests to find out some diagnostic things, imaging, blood tests, all sorts of things. Whereas that wouldn't have happened then. They all cost money. But on the other hand, if you do those tests, you're going to have a much better idea of what the problem's likely to be. There's a trade-off here. But how you balance that can be quite tricky. And there's, we should not be telling a clinician what tests they should be undertaking because it's their job to know. But there's a budget constraint. So balancing that off requires a proper dialogue in terms of healthcare, with the healthcare professionals to find out how they can be best incentivized to improve the outcomes for the patients with costs either flatlining or preferably going down and not endangering the life of anybody. On the other hand, how can we keep spending in the social support area to improve outcomes when we've got a gradual rise in public pensions and private publicly paid pensions that are going to take away from these other types of support that may be more important at times. Carefully thinking it out at the start is important. And if you reform the public pension system, the old age pension framework that everybody gets, or should get, to reform that, you've got to be thinking at least 20 years ahead. Because if you don't, you're going to have problems. So here's the age-related expenditure, right, as gone through time. So the projection for 2030 is it's not quite 2.5 times or so, nearly 3, not quite 3, what it was in 1970 in the advanced economies. You can see already in the emerging economies, it's already going up quite sharply. So the designs are important. And pensions and healthcare are a major challenge. And that first point is true. It's not easy. It's very difficult. And there's a lot of trade-offs that you need to think about. And importantly, and this is my limited experience of this, there's not been an adequate dialogue with the clinicians, healthcare professionals, when ministers of finance in particular have been involved in trying to reform this. It's the Ministry of Finance in some countries that's been the instigator of the reforms rather than the Ministry of Health. And there's been poor dialogues and they've had really perverse outcomes. So this is not a command control exercise. People need to understand why, what, and how, and work out how to best deliver the outcome that produces proper benefit to the public generally, maintaining, or ideally trying to lean into any pressure to increase the cost, but and actually deliver even better services. It's not easy. Then these are the key points here, right? Population rising, population aging, Baumol effect. You just think about a common or garden general practice doctor, right? They can still only see a patient every 15 minutes, 20 minutes or whatever on average. And so as the population goes up, you've got to have more GPs. Technology can't necessarily improve that. There's a lot of effort being put into that, but the Baumol effect's definitely prevalent here. The type of delivery of service, what type of insurance, whether it's public insurance, universal public insurance, it's private insurance, there are debatable points in that. Some countries just don't like it, the United States. And what types of diseases? If we go back 80 years, 100 years, right? Obesity and diabetes were not that prevalent. They're very prevalent now because had lifestyle changes, diet changes. Those changes are not conducive to good health. This is an educational matter that could be well taught at primary school. Some of these things you can address right early on so you don't get the problem in the first place, right? Education. So when some of these things you're actually having to integrate across different arms of government. So you've got a coordinated approach. It's not just one agency that will be helping drive this. So thinking about how to best implement that requires a multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach. Come on into the slide here. And so these are the challenges, right? They're not easy. Health inequality, inefficiencies of provision, and costs always going up. People always want the most advanced MRI machine for doing this, or the whiz-bang accelerator to do targeted radiotherapy on people, right? Costs always going up. And retirement systems. There's been a huge amount of effort in many countries on this, how to best tackle this problem. Some countries have done quite well in it, others have not. So you're designing the public pension system, designing the private pension system is very, very important. But there's a lot of information gaps. And whether it should be government provision, private provision, whether the individuals should decide themselves, these are quite debatable points. And we can see with certain countries' experiences, they've made a complete mess of it. Partially from politics, partially from behaviors, partially from poor designs of other things. I'm not going to answer the question as we got in the slide, but it's an important topic. I do encourage you to look at the appendix for this lecture on this. We've got two basic frameworks in terms of pensions, a defined contribution and a defined benefit. Now, the general publicly provided one is a defined benefit. You work for 40 years, you've put in a percentage of your tax or direct tax into it, and you get some money out at the end. There are many issues with these, especially when you're what they call pay-as-you-go frameworks, where today's people pay for today's retirees rather than the other way around. There's many issues in here. Defined contribution is fully funded, you're saving over time, and that pot of money saved generates a cash flow at the end of it. But there are trade-offs in each of these. Careful design is required. And these are your two main ways of looking at it, changing the parameters that drive it. And you'll see some countries have been gradually increasing the retirement age. And 55 to 60 to 65 to 70. Some countries are reluctant to change the age, big political fights about it. And the structural, this comes down to choosing between the defined benefit, defined contribution, or having some hybrid of those, how it's funded or pay as you go. These are all things that you need to think through. When we can't solve this today, I'm just going to give you the outlines. And here's the lessons learned. Implementation, how you do it. One, it's difficult. Two, it can have serious bad outcomes if it's not thought through. Whether you're going to have a mandatory or voluntary framework. Voluntary, usually people need to be incentivized. What are the costs of running this, the administrative costs? Some countries, the costs of administering it are vast. And there are various ways of doing it. And then transitioning from one to another can be incredibly costly. New Zealand in 1974 introduced a fully funded system. It became an incredibly political battle. At the election the following year, the administration that brought in the funded scheme was ejected from the Treasury benches. The new government brought in a pay-as-you-go system, and it was incredibly generous, but then it nearly bankrupted the country, and within 15 years they had to reform it. It was an awful lot of mess as a consequence. The ultimate consequence of it is that this particular issue has still not been resolved nearly 50 years later, and it's still a mess. And there is definitely a multiple tiers on this, first, second, and third tier, where the first one is the critical one that many countries had in the first instance in terms of public provision. It's basically to make sure that when people retired in their old age, they weren't going to be in abject poverty. The next one is where you've got mandatory to help provide some smoothing of consumption over time. And there's many countries have done that. There's this one for New Zealand, this cheap and simple savings plan, that was brought in 14 years ago. I think it's been successful, but people my age didn't buy into it because we couldn't afford to, and so we don't have it. Third tier pensions, these are voluntary. These are just private pensions, basically. And they've been around for an awful long time. They are successful in some countries and not in others. But the tax system is critical to them functioning well. And New Zealand tried to do this third tier pension, and what they ended up doing was the tax system was such that nobody went into it because they ended up being taxed as they put the money in. The savings pool was taxed as it grew, and when it paid out, it was taxed as well. That was incredibly regressive tax, and it obviously didn't go well at all. Yeah. When we've also got sustainable development goals to link into all of that, these have got expenditure associated with them. So, sustainable development and increasing our revenue, increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of expenditure investment, and improving how debt is managed. These are all things to contribute into thinking about sustainable development. And then, last but not least, expenditure is important. You need to think about constantly reforming how you're spending, because otherwise it will just keep going up forever. You can't tax the country to death, in other words. If you've already got a high tax burden, you've got to think carefully, and maybe you're better off actually cutting taxes. There's the Laffer curve effect. If you cut, in some instances, if you cut taxes, you're going to get more income. Emerging and developing markets, this is trying to support the growing demand for public services, but at the same time, having to mobilize revenue resources so you can pay for it, but not kill the economy. So we'll be talking about revenue mobilization tomorrow. I'm 7 minutes over. I'm surprised, but I must have rushed the last bit. I'm sorry. Please look at the appendices. Any questions before we take a break? Did I go too long over, Anne?
You took a few extra minutes, but I think today it may be okay. Since we have, I don't think our workshop will be very long. So maybe